Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Welcome to this absolutely exceptional new video. I am currently in Rawash, a site that is closed to the public here in Egypt, with a huge pit in which I am currently standing, and behind me over there, a rather massive trench. Wait, let me take you. I'll show you. There you go. This is a truly exceptional site, which is considered by some to be a pyramid. But other researchers, especially some Italians, I'm being careful not to fall flat on my face. But other Italian researchers have put forward a hypothesis that I agree with, and I'll explain to you why. You'll need to look up a little bit at the end of the video to understand, and who think that we are dealing with a somewhat hybrid design, halfway between pyramids and a temple. For some people as well, this pyramid was completed and then completely destroyed, looted, and so on. For others, however, no, it was not, and in this video we will also explain the different points of view. John Perring, a British engineer and Egyptologist in the mid-19th century, was one of the first authors to describe the site, and in an 1842 publication he called it the Pyramid of Abu Rawash. It is from him that people initially thought it was a pyramid. However, there is not much left of this pyramid, as you can see, because the site was dismantled, as it was valued for the supply of stones it could provide, or at least that's what we assume. And it was only at the end of the year 1900 that the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology would intervene to conduct excavations for 5 months, and conclude all extraction stories at the site. So to whom can we attribute this site? Well, we found sandstone fragments with the cartouche of Djedefre, the son of Khufu and brother of Khafre. Emile Chassina, a French Egyptologist from the early 20th century, found a life-size head of the king, as well as lower parts of his statuette bearing the name of Djedefre or Djedefre. You could say it like that too. So it's confirmation that we're, in quotes, in his place, or at least that he was the most famous occupant at the time. How should I put it? The most famous usufructuary? Chassina will also discover in one of the temple's rooms 5 engraved limestone pedestals that held the statues of 5 of King Flinder's 6 children. Petrie, another British Egyptologist, places Djedefre between Mykerinos and Shepsiskaf, the son of Mykerinos. However, today, Egyptology places Djedefre immediately after Khufu, partly because Djedefre's name is found inside one of the boat pits next to Khufu's pyramid. Other king lists, such as the Abydos list for example, and the Saqqara list, seem to confirm that Djedefre did indeed succeed Khufu. It's fascinating to observe the evolution of history, particularly regarding the pharaohs of Egypt in 1897. Flinders Petrie published a book called A History of Egypt, which covers Egyptian history up to the 16th dynasty. And in it, he talks about Djedefre, and for the dates of this pharaoh, he suggests 3784 before Christ to 3759 before Christ. So at that time, they were over 1,000 years earlier than the dates we consider today. In the ruins, Flinders Petrie discovered what he thought was granite chest fragments, and a diorite statue were found, which is unusual for 4th dynasty pyramids. The pieces of the statue included several pieces of faces, a piece of a throne, as well as, wait, let me make sure I'm not telling you anything wrong. A piece of the throne, in fact, on which there was an inscription bearing the name of Men, something Ra. One might think it's Menkaura, the Egyptian name for Mykerinos. However, Mykerinos lived 50 or 60 years after Djedefre, which poses a problem. In the end, it makes sense to consider Menkaura, also known as Mykerinos, because actually, Mykerinos could have come back here to finish or complete the work that was originally started. Because Khufu, his casing is in limestone, Khafre, his casing is just a little bit in granite, and Mykerinos, the first 16 courses are in granite. So we can easily imagine that Mykerinos, after building the 3rd pyramid of Giza, well, the 3rd pyramid of Giza came here. Quite simply, to implement another type of construction, another building that initially might have been intended to be entirely covered in granite. And that's Rainer Stadelmann, a German Egyptologist, who talks about this reuse of the site. So this site is located on a hill. And it has been calculated that a structure with a base similar to the Pyramid of Mykerinos would be about 105 meters and would have had a higher summit than the Great Pyramid. So that means a much steeper inclination than Mykerinos, Miragliolio, and Rinaldi. Italian Egyptologists have indeed found granite blocks from Parmen with an angle of 60 degrees, which could correspond to this very steep inclination. The ancient Egyptians were familiar with the area, because you will see in the image that the highlighted area at the top right contains cemeteries dating from the 1st to the 6th dynasty. And there are areas where the natural outcrop here is of such poor quality that it had to be replaced with cut limestone blocks. Which shows, on the other hand, that at this point the Egyptians might not have known how poor the quality of the rock was when they began building this structure. Otherwise, they likely would have selected a different construction site. Despite the 60-degree granite blocks, the Italians found no granite-facing blocks installed in their original position. And they commented on the obvious absence of any thorough limestone facing. So we can ask ourselves the question, was this structure really a pyramid with a facing? The Italians raised the possibility that the height of the structure was never greater than it is today, that is, 12 meters. What about Chasina, whom we just mentioned? The granite casing had a height that is impossible to estimate, but it must have been less than, or at most equal to that reached in the pyramid of Mykerinos. As I said before, 16 courses of masonry. Many 19th and 20th century authors describe large piles of granite pieces. Rinaldi and Miragliolio, however, appear slightly less impressed. In their studies, they determined that after careful examination, the term enormous quantity doesn't seem appropriate. There are certainly abundant fragments here, you just have to look.
Here.
But it's really incomparable to what we find around Mykerinos and around Khafre in terms of the amount of granite. If he had to make any kind of facing? Well, of course, there's a lot of information to take in. That's why I suggest we take a little digestive break here in front of the pyramids. And this will also be an opportunity for me to tell you that if you want to join the next adventure I'm organizing and leading here in Egypt, well, don't hesitate to go. In the video description, you'll find the link with all the information. Let's take a breath. We've had this short break. Now it's time to return to a Rawash for the remainder of the video. A quick side note as I was leaving the site. And a magnificent granite block with visible tool marks. I must emphasize this because here you can observe that the grooves go in one direction and right next to them they go in another, all over the place. It's really magnificent to see this work. So, there are actually a few granite blocks. There are obviously some, the small ones are reconstructions, very recent reconstructions, to be able to access the site, because actually you have to climb back there before getting to the trench path. There are other granite blocks, but as the Italians mentioned, they are not in their original facing positions. So it's very complicated to analyze them, especially since apart from these blocks, as you can see in the image, my friends, when it comes to granite, there's nothing left. And that's still the case for our two Italians. They discovered a few granite blocks with only one side meticulously carved. Along with the other blocks, which were as loose as those of the Pyramid of Mykerinos, they concluded the pyramid was never finished. In the center of the north face, we have a large trench, so, as you've seen, which is absolutely gigantic, which is 5 to 7 meters wide and 49 meters long, and it goes down from where I am all the way to the pit. John Perring states the downward angle is 22 degrees, while the Italians propose 27 to 28 degrees. In any case, what I can tell you is that it's dangerous enough to imagine that this trench may have had a technical function and wasn't meant to be used in the future. In this trench, we have remains on 5 levels of cut and assembled limestone, which are actually similar to the 5 levels of limestone. So here we are at the end of the trench, which are similar to 5 other levels of limestone that are here in the pit, as you can see. So here, when we're at the top of the trench, this is what we see at the level of the cut blocks. So these 5 levels may seem excessive, of course. In my opinion, the Egyptians likely used such thickness because they quickly realized the natural rock here was of poor quality. That they needed to compensate a little, let's put it that way. A bit like the layers of the hill in which the Sphinx was carved. If I make this comparison, it's because the Sphinx is here. In both cases, we're dealing with a limestone hill. So here, in the pit, in terms of dimensions, we're looking at 23 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 21 meters deep. When you look up, this is what you see. As you notice, the ground is not flat at all. Anyway, it was tiled, so it wasn't meant to be flat underneath. And then, with all the thousands of years that have passed, that have gone by, of course, there has been a lot of damage. But here we are also facing a second pit. And in this pit, we obviously still have the limestone blocks in their original place, here. And so we could also imagine, instead of a secondary pit, maybe an area where the limestone is missing. Today, sure, but back then, it may have been used to level the pit. However, Volodya, who is another Egyptologist, a Swiss Egyptologist who came here from 1995 to 2004, he believes the second pit held the sarcophagus of the deceased. So, he is one of those who believe that we are indeed looking at a pyramid in which the deceased Djedefre was supposed to be buried. Something the Italians don't really agree with. So while some claim that the pyramid was completed, the question is, where did all the rough core stone go? Because generally, there's not a big market for that material, at least not a sufficient one. When I talk about this material, it's limestone, raw limestone like this. You just have to look a little at what's happening in Giza, where even the small structures like the secondary pyramids or the mastabas remain relatively intact. What was sought after, on the other hand, were the fine stones, like the Tura limestone, which made up the casing of the pyramids of Khufu and Khafra, as well as granite. And anyway, you can see that around the pyramids of Khafra and Menkaure, with countless granite blocks showing signs of looting, cutting, reuse. It's simply like an open-air quarry. So, that would mean that Abu Rawash would have been the only pyramid in Egypt to be almost completely dismantled to reuse low-quality limestone. I don't really believe that, because on top of that, you really have to keep in mind just how colossal a task dismantling a pyramid actually is. When you look at the north face of the Pyramid of Mykerinos, which is practically the same size as the one at Abu Rawash. If it had been a pyramid, well, you can see a big notch. I'm sure you've all seen it before, and it shows just how difficult it is to try to deconstruct a pyramid. Because that notch dates back to the end of the 12th century when the son and heir of Saladin tried to demolish the pyramids. So, he began with Mykerinos' pyramid. After only 8 months, this was the outcome. So how long would it have taken to completely dismantle the pyramid of Abu Rawash? I didn't do a ratio, a cross multiplication, but it would be at least 20, 25, maybe. 30 years of work and intensive dismantling. That seems unlikely, especially since why this one and not Gizeh's or Dashur's? And so for Volodya, it was a completed construction, but instead of thorough architectural observations to support his theory, he tried to show that, contrary to the list of kings on the Turin Papyrus, which gives Djedefre a reign of 8 years, which is too short to build a pyramid. Djedefre would have been responsible for the logistics of burying Khufu's boat 23 years after his death. His reign would have lasted 23 years, which aligns more closely with the reign durations of the 4th dynasty pharaohs believed to have built the pyramids. On the other hand, why would Djedefre have waited 23 years to bury his late father's boat? I admit it's still unclear, only God knows. Now, since we were talking about Giza, let's do a quick recap of the constructions at Giza. So you have to understand that Khufu and Khafra used the hill to build their pyramids. It's the same here. Volodya explains that the rocky core where I am is something very important, which will represent 44% of the total volume of the pyramid. Others have tried the same calculation, but they came up with a percentage closer to 30%. But it's still colossal because neither Khafra nor Khufu have 30% of their total mass. represented by the rock of the hill, the natural bedrock. If we were talking about Khufu earlier, let's make a comparison with what this pyramid would have been in Khufu's volume. It's 2.6 million cubic meters. Menkaure is only 250,000 cubic meters. At Rawash, here it would have been about the same thing. 250,000 cubic meters then, with, as we said, 30% rock core. That is just over 75,000 cubic meters. And so, with 175,000 cubic meters of cut quarry blocks, well, let's say we'll count 150,000 cubic meters. Because you have to remove the facing, which would have been either granite or granite and Taurus limestone. So not extracted here in the surroundings, because yes, the blocks come from the area. It's the same thing at Khafra. The guys aren't stupid, they don't bother, they take the limestone where there is some. There's an infinite amount of it, so that's Khafra and Khufu. They repeated their actions, which I can prove. Breaking this rule was unjustified. And what about Volodya? He mentions an old quarry adjacent to the Rawash site here, for which he estimates the amount of usable stone at 200,000 cubic meters, which, according to him, would perfectly meet the needs of the pyramid. But we must not forget that we know quarrying is not an efficient operation, and that a lot of waste can be generated during the extraction of materials. We can talk about 30% almost as waste. Let's calculate. 200,000 cubic meters minus 30% is 140,000 cubic meters. That's the exact amount needed for the pyramid. However, this would leave nothing for the mastabas, valley temples, or the sacred causeway, which studies suggest would have been Europe's largest. So, if there are no other quarries to be discovered here, that would indeed suggest to some people that the construction was unfinished. Yet given the long reign of Djedefre, that seems unlikely. He should have had enough time to look for stones elsewhere, or else they would have first found another better supplied location before starting any project. And then, here there's also the intensive use of mud bricks and things like that. They are relatively poor quality when it comes to the enclosure walls, everything around the pyramid, and so on. Compared to the Khufu complex, it's extremely mediocre. Why mention Khufu? Because it's right after Khufu I went off track. So the workforce from Khufu would very likely still have been available for the pharaoh, and all the resources needed for building a pyramid would also still have been at his disposal. So there's a certain inconsistency at that level. In any case, he certainly should have been able to do something better than what we see today at Abu Rawash. So how can we explain this anomaly? Well, as I said at the beginning of the video, maybe it's simply here at Abu Rawash. It wasn't a pyramid, but a kind of hybrid construction. And I'm going to show you the element that, for me, confirms what the Italians and other independent researchers think. Because when you look up, you realize that we are in a pit 21 meters deep at the bottom of the trench we talked about. But it's very likely that what we see up there that could have been the roof. The roof of this hybrid structure, quite simply. Well, of course, that's just my opinion, and it's not very well supported. I don't have the luxury of spending 9 years here to study the site. What remains absolutely certain to me is that this pyramid was never built, never completed, because otherwise we would have much more impressive remains than what we see from the outside, which is really nothing special in the end. Because the main interest of this site is to see its interior, the trench, the pit, and this completely unusual setting. But you might say, and here I'm playing devil's advocate myself, indeed, there's no reason to find this anywhere else if the other pyramids, for their part, were completed. My friends, I hope you enjoyed this exclusive video of a site closed to the public. On my end, I'm going to keep wandering around everywhere to bring you back as much as possible. Videos and pictures for my Facebook and Insta followers. And until we meet again for the next video on the channel, as always, take care of yourselves, and above all, don't forget to keep the passion alive. Bye.